Tuesday Tarts. This week we're going to talk about another name of God, and that's the name El Hay or El Chay. I've heard it pronounced two different ways. I think it's probably El Hay, and it means the living God. And I've got a few scriptures here where it talks about God is the living God. You know, it's translated from El Hay. And the first scripture I'm going to go to is in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 26. And this is talking about the Israelites, or Moses has been talking to the Israelites about the Ten Commandments. And they've been there at Mount Sinai. They're talking to Moses, says, "For who is there of all flesh that hath heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as we have and lived?" So they were acknowledging that God was a living God, that he was speaking to them. And, you know, they were scared because they were afraid they were going to die because they'd heard the voice of God. Then our next reference, we'll go over to Joshua chapter 3, verse 10. And this is when the Israelites are getting ready to cross the Jordan River, going into the Promised Land. And Joshua's talking to them. And it says there in verse 10, it says, "And Joshua said, Hereby ye shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Hivites and the Perizzites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Jebusites." So Joshua's, reassuring the Israelites that the living God, he's alive. He's always alive, always has been, always will be, is going with them. And they'll be able to drive out their enemies and take the Promised Land. Then our next scripture is in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 26. And this is the story of David and Goliath. And this is right when they're getting ready to fight, or when David's getting ready to kill Goliath. There really wasn't a fight. And, David, everybody thought David was too small and too weak to do it. He was a young boy, but it says, "And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So David wasn't scared because he knew that his God, our God, is a living God. And if he's with you, and if he's guiding you to do something, he'll be there to strengthen you for whatever you need. Our next reference is in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 4. And this is during the reign of King Hezekiah over Judah. And Assyria is getting ready to come and try to take over Israel, take over Judah. And Hezekiah was a righteous king, and he trusted the Lord, but he wanted some reassurance. So he sent somebody to talk to the prophet Isaiah to get some reassurance about it. So there in verse 4 of chapter 19, he says, "It may be the Lord thy God will hear all the words of Rabshakeh, whom the king of Assyria, his master, hath sent to reprove the living God, and will reprove the words which the Lord thy God hath heard. Wherefore lift up thy prayer for the remnant that are left." So Hezekiah is, asking Isaiah to reassure the people that, they serve a living God, and even though the Assyrians were a mighty army, that they were no match for the living God. Now we're going to go over to Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 36. And Jeremiah is talking to about some false prophets that are, making false prophecies about God and about, the Israelite nation. And he's telling them here in verse 36, and he says, "And the burden of the Lord shall ye mention no more, for every man's word shall be his burden. For ye have perverted the words of the living God, of the Lord of hosts, our God." So he's reprimanding these false prophets to tell them that they have perverted the name, the word of the living God. They've told false prophecies. And then we're going to finish up in Daniel, a couple of passages of Daniel. The first one I'm going to go to is chapter 4, verse 34. And this is when Daniel is interpreting a dream for King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Chapter 4, verse 34. And Daniel had interpreted the dream, and then Nebuchadnezzar actually fulfilled the dream, and he had stood up and claimed to be stronger and mightier than God. And, God made me go crazy and lived out in the field, out in the wild for a long time till he cried out to God, and God restored him. And this is what this is talking about here in verse 34 says, "And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom from generation to generation." So Nebuchadnezzar recognized that God, our God, is the Most High God, and he liveth forever. He's the living God. And then on over to chapter 6. This is talking about when Daniel was in the lion's den. When I think it was King Darius had put him in the lion's den. Chapter 6, verse 20 says, "And when he came to the den," this was the king, he rode, he came to check on Daniel. He was sad that he had to throw him in the lion's den. He said, "He came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel, and the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions?" And of course, God did deliver him because he's the living God. And then over in verse 26, after King Darius had seen that Daniel made out of the lion's den and how that God, the living God, had worked a miracle, he said, "I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and steadfast forever. In his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end." So even this King Darius realized that the living God, his kingdom will go on forever. And that, he's a living God. He's not an idol or a stone or a statue, but he's a living God. And I thank you all for joining us here again. And if you have any prayer requests, let us know. And we look forward to talking to you next week.